6 years post-global financial crisis, there's still a lot of debate about whether the banking system is any better prepared today to fend off calamity. In his latest book, Shifts and Shocks, Financial Times economics commentator Martin Wolf argues radical reforms may be needed to prevent another disaster. We talked earlier, and I asked him what some of the fundamental issues were that drove the credit crisis.
Well, I'm not sure inevitable is quite the right word, but at least very likely. Essentially, the argument of the book is that two sorts of forces came together. The first were huge global changes, of which the most important probably was globalization, the entry of China into the world economy, and then after the Asian crisis, the emergence of huge current account surpluses in the emerging world. This interacted with rising inequality in our countries, which made our people, particularly households, very debt dependent if they wanted to retain their standards of living. And finally, these big circumstances created the conditions for rising house prices because they lowered real interest rates. We got into this global savings glut, as it's sometimes called, in which real interest rates were very low. That pushed up the prices of long-lived real assets like housing. That was the sort of real side. And then on the financial side, we liberalized the financial sector. In the conditions I've described, the financial sector had all the material it needed, cheap finance, lots of money coming in from the emerging world to push the balance sheets, to explode the balance sheets of the financial sector. Regulation more or less collapsed. We encouraged, because we liked the boom, we encouraged them to leverage themselves up to the hilt. So we got this incredibly huge credit boom, and the financial sector at the end of this ended up with essentially no capital, no buffer. And it was the two things together that led us into this terrible mess in 2007, 2008.
Many of those things were driven by ideology, by fundamental beliefs in certain kind of frameworks, including by, you could argue, undue Margaret Thatcher, Alan Greenspan, some of which you did believe in. What did we get wrong? What were we driving towards that was actually a mistake?
Well, the macro side of this that I've described, I think I got reasonably well. My previous book, Fixing Global Finance, was very much about that. So I think I understood the dangers with the imbalances, what was going on on this sort of the flow of savings to people who were not using it well. What I think I was a little worried about, but not nearly worried enough about, was what it was doing to the financial sector. I tended to share the view of many that the financial sector should be able to understand its risks reasonably well. I didn't expect perfection, but at least reasonably well, that they would run their affairs with moderate prudence. I didn't look very closely at the balance sheets of these institutions, and there were many risks. What happened with these collateralized debt obligations, the off-balance sheet vehicles of the big banks, the role of AIG as an insurer, many things going on in the system of which I had really no understanding. And I think, amazingly, almost nobody did. So I think we were far too insouciant about these risks, and I certainly shared this with many of the top regulators, you might even say most of the top regulators of the world.
You are critical in the book of central bankers and Ben Bernanke by name. Some now wondering whether he read that part when he heartily endorsed your book on the cover.
He's an honest and decent man, I think, and I think he recognizes that he got a lot wrong. That's one of the things I respect in him.
Well, and of course that you do suggest that he didn't see it coming, as many, as you point out, intelligent people didn't. You are the laudatory of the response. The world responded to the crisis well, but then stopped. Was it that shift from stimulus to austerity where we began to lose our way?
Lose our way is perhaps a bit harsh, and here one has to stress particularly the complete mess the Eurozone made of its crisis. I haven't talked about that. But yes, I think it's clear from his remarks. He made many speeches, including just before the crisis in July 2007, in which he said the subprime crisis was not going to be at all significant. Well, that was clearly wrong. But when the crisis hit, the governments and central banks of the world, and I mean really here from September 2008, up to then it was a bit here and there, but from September 2008, for about a year, they did a great job, because I really do think we were facing another Great Depression. Nobody will know how bad it was. It was a real disaster in those first few months. That was stopped. The economy started recovering within 6 months. Quite extraordinary. But then, partly because of the Eurozone crisis, partly because shifts in ideology, we stopped being willing to use fiscal policy imaginatively. We started thinking the crisis would end quickly when it was completely obvious to me and many others, I wrote this in January 2009, that it was likely to be a very, very long drawn out post-crisis deleveraging process. And then we had this massive crisis in the Eurozone, which really has paralyzed the Eurozone, though Mario Draghi has done a wonderful job in trying to keep things going. And that together, the ideology of austerity, the mess in the Eurozone, which is reinforced by the ideology of austerity there under German influence, has made the crisis very long drawn out, very painful, and I think unnecessarily so.